to the BCLA GradConnect Research Symposium. We are immensely grateful for your attendance and participation today. Your presence here not only enriches our event, but also embodies the spirit of intellectual curiosity and scholarly exchange that we cherish at LMU. We would literally not be able to do this without you. I'm Braden Ritchie, a second-year graduate student in the Philosophy MA program here at LMU. In addition to my academic pursuits, I have the privilege of serving as the graduate student assistant to Dr. Brad Stone, the Associate Dean of Graduate Education and Faculty Affairs within BCLA. My role as president of the graduate students of LMU, a position I hold with immense pride, has also been made possible through Dr. Stone's unwavering guidance and support. It's an honor to be a part of an academic community that continually fosters growth and collaboration. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting 4 exceptional speakers, each presenting a vital strand of the graduate study within our college. Our symposium will unfold as follows. So Megan Morris from Yoga Studies will present her paper entitled What Was, What Is Becoming, An Evolution of Thought Within Yoga Studies. Second, we'll have Bianca Gray from English, who will share her paper entitled Old Dogs, New Tongues, The Problem with Language in the Classroom. And then third, we're going to have Seraphina Blake from Theology delve into her paper called Hearts on Fire, Reimagining LGBTQ plus Pastoral Accompaniment with Synodal Spirituality. And then fourth, we have Patrick Hall from Philosophy, who will conclude the presentations with Coming Home to Thinking. Following each presentation, we'll have about an 8-minute discussion period, allowing for an immediate engagement with the ideas presented. At 6:30 p.m., we'll open the floor for a broader 30-minute discussion, inviting all attendees to participate in an exchange of thoughts and perspectives. Before we begin, Dr. Stone, has a pillar of support and inspiration of our graduate community, has some introductory remarks to share with us. His words, I'm certain, will set the perfect tone for the stimulating discussions to follow. Thank you once again for joining us today, and let's embark on this journey of learning and discovery together.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Dean Robin Crabtree and the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, I would like to welcome you to the Fall Graduate Symposium, sponsored with BCLA GradConnect and hosted by Braden Ritchie, GSLMU President and second-year Philosophy MA candidate. We are glad to be together today. Special thanks to our presenters this evening, Megan Morris, Bianca Gray, Seraphina Blake, and Patrick Hall. I look forward to your presentations and the enlightening conversation we will have. I want to offer a quick comment about thinking anew, our theme for the evening. French philosopher Michel Foucault, in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, which is an homage and reconsideration of the famous essay by the same name written by the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, rephrases the question in the following way. What is the meaning of today? How can today be different from the past? We have challenged our presenters to offer their thoughts today, their thoughts of today, to not simply rely on yesterday's answers. These presentations were written quite recently, and this event is the debut of that work. What they present today will hopefully open for them and for us future avenues of thought. Today is a day in which thinking will take place. Today, our presenters will join their voices to what Norman Melchert calls the great conversation. Although the work of today's presenters is new, it connects to and reconfigures and engages with and re-examines the traditions of thought from the past. As American philosopher William James once said, sometimes even a new name for an old way of thinking opens new possibilities. Our current situation, locally, nationally, and globally, calls us to think anew. Today's presenters have heeded this call. May we all listen and think with them. Think anew. I'm grateful for this moment today. this moment called today. May it lead us to new tomorrows, tomorrows that in the past had not yet been hoped, thought, or imagined. So I look forward to thinking anew tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. So without further ado, we can jump straight into the very first presentation with Megan Morris. So Megan, you can take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Megan Maris, and I am representing the Yoga Studies Department. So the title of my work today that I'm presenting is What Was, What Is Becoming, an Evolution of Thought Within Yoga Studies. As the field of yoga studies is in its early stages of origination, it has the opportunity to consider if it should maintain the norms of academia or innovate new standards of intellectual pursuit. The scholars of today are simultaneously defining the current expression of yoga studies, as well as influencing what the field will become. To think anew in a field which is in its inception, yet whose beginnings span centuries into the past, necessitates unique considerations. Does the field gain credibility if it maintains formalized academy standards, or should its scholars bravely forge an innovative model of education? The fallout of disrupting formalized academy norms could result in a loss of legitimacy after the toil of establishing itself within academic institutions. However, setting a new precedent holds the potential for the field to maintain the spirit of thinking anew. Perhaps for today, we will be left with more questions to consider than solutions to be implemented. But to begin again, we must first look to the past to understand the foundation which the field stands upon. A reimagining of a modern academic approach to an ancient subject demands that the field discerns and reconciles the mistakes that scholarship has made along the way. Yoga's foundation has a long and complex history. A challenge that the modern scholar is faced with is first untangling yoga's diversity of philosophical and metaphysical frameworks. The endeavor is typically approached through the study of yoga texts. Even within a broad survey of yoga's various schools or through a philological study of the word yoga, it becomes clear that it cannot be defined as one thing, as it has had different meanings throughout its evolution. Misunderstandings can begin with the word yoga, as it is used interchangeably, referring to techniques or as a goal. The term is derived from the Sanskrit verbal root yuj, which means to yoke, to join, to fasten. In the early texts, this generally referred to the yoking of the horse to the chariot. The Katha Upanishad used the metaphor of the body as the chariot, the mind as the reins, the senses as the horses, the intellect as the charioteer, the innermost self as the passenger in the chariot, and the sense objects as the various paths that our senses take us on through our life. The act of yoking was to rein the senses in and bring them under the conscious control of the buddhi, or the discerning aspect of the mind. When this occurs, one experiences yoga as a state of spiritual liberation. The state of being has been described as an experience of oneness or union by the non-dualistic branches of yoga. However, even within the various schools of non-dualism, there is not a consensus of what is being united. In contrast, the dualistic schools based on Samkhya philosophy describe a disjoining between the inner self and material existence. The dualistic and non-dualistic branches, as well as their tributaries, have distinct aims and systems which lead to their particular goals. These distinctions require the scholar of yoga to study the primary text of the tradition, which is a distinguishing factor of the field and a less common practice within popular yoga, which we find in modern studio culture. The task of primary textual study within yoga studies has proven to be a challenge, as one must first obtain a copy of the often hard-to-find text and then be able to translate the text from its original language. Many of the yoga texts were written in Sanskrit, but there are also numerous texts written within the vernacular language. When a scholar is unable to translate the texts themselves, they are reliant upon translators. The translator is inevitably bound to their cultural background inherent biases, which influence the choices that they make while translating. The translator also has to consider their audience, which will further influence the construction of their translations. Therefore, translations of the same text can have varying results, leaving the reader with different interpretations. The scholar who is reliant upon the translator must recognize all of these factors when approaching a text to study. The role of the philologist is to be laser focused with the text that they are working with, whereas the philosopher is taking in the broader landscape of the text throughout yoga's history. Even with the greatest care taken, both the philologist and philosopher are speculating as their research is based on a subject that is often thousands of years old. Thinking anew in the field would support an interdisciplinary approach, bridging the scholars of philology and philosophy to avoid the mistakes of previous scholarship. To provide context for yoga's evolution of thought, it would be helpful to share a few definitions that have developed over time. The following are some of the most familiar and referenced from the tradition. The Katha Upanishad provides us with the first known and recorded definition of yoga. When the senses are firmly reined in, that is yoga. The Bhagavad Gita offers several definitions of yoga, but the following are commonly cited. It is said that evenness of mind is yoga, and yoga is skill in action. The 4th to 5th century Yoga Sutra of Patanjali says, yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. As yoga evolved during the medieval period, the Hatha yoga traditions positioned the body as the location for the mastery of practice. Rather than defining yoga, the 15th century Hatha Pradipika declared the practitioner will succeed, the non-practitioner will not. Success in yoga is not achieved by merely reading books. Success is achieved neither by wearing the right clothes nor by talking about it. Practice alone brings success. The common thread between these definitions centers around a quality of the mind and a form of action, both of which require a body. The goals of these definitions are not explicitly stated. However, each one, the reining of the senses, the steadiness of mind, the skillful action, and the requirement of practice, are all considered to be necessary conditions for spiritual liberation. These definitions are predicated upon the understanding that suffering is interwoven into human existence. But suffering can be alleviated through the realization of spiritual truths. Although a singular definition denies the diversity of thought that has evolved throughout the tradition, we can surmise that yoga is a mind-body discipline, which incorporates a plurality of practices that influence a person psychophysiologically, socially, and offers the component of spiritual health. Academia has traditionally favored the approach of maintaining distance between the researcher and the subject to avoid the biases, which may color and potentially distort the researcher's perception and dissemination of their work. The notion of the practitioner-scholar can be a contentious debate within the field of yoga studies. Most modern practitioners would argue that yoga is something that you do, and true understanding is revealed through direct experience rather than intellectual inquiry. However, the modern transnational yoga community has done damage to its own credibility, as the industry is unregulated, allowing teachers to make claims without any accountability or responsibility to be accurate, and in some cases, spreading dangerous and harmful information. It is to this point that scholarship can atone for the catchphrases that may be digestible for the general audience, but continue a long line of cultural and historical misunderstanding, misappropriation, insensitivity, and abuse of power. However, a purely academic approach to yoga is also problematic. Although academia may be more accountable to accuracy, it could be argued that the scholar only possesses a superficial knowledge of yoga, which can equally contribute to distorting the essence of the teachings. Perhaps where a pure academic approach becomes most concerning is in the perpetuation of the legacy of colonialism. Contributing to the complexities of scholarship in yoga studies are the years of foreign colonial rule in South Asia and the detrimental repercussions that resulted from cruel and unjust subjugation, stripping a culture of its history and indigenous practices. Adding to these injustices was the arrogance of the Western scholars to shape and mold the narrative of Indian philosophy and present it to the world. To begin anew in the field of yoga studies requires a deconstruction of the tropes, assumptions, and prejudices which have dominated the Western approach to South Asian studies. To begin again requires translators, researchers, ethnographers, sociologists, philosophers, philologists, and practitioners to recognize their own biases and how their conditioned perception can cause great harm to peoples and cultures when it perpetuates academic colonialism. Yoga studies has a wide umbrella of different academic approaches, which includes yoga therapy. Historically, yoga has highlighted its many health benefits, but these merits were considered to be byproducts of the practice rather than the goal. Today, it is much more common to practice yoga for the purpose of restoring health. Thinking anew in the field of yoga studies has the potential to address the inequities of physical and mental health within marginalized communities. Due to the intersections of health science and evidence-based research, we now know that yoga practices such as postures, breath control, and meditation influence neurocognitive, metabolic, cardiorespiratory, and psychophysiological functions. In addition, these practices have been shown to influence the autonomic nervous system, improving conditions such as anxiety, depression, stress, and trauma, while regulating emotional and cognitive functioning. The regulation of the autonomic nervous system is an essential step to shift from habitual reactivity to thoughtful responsiveness. The Bhagavad Gita offered the definitions of yoga as skill and action, which is predicated on the evenness of mind that yoga practices bestow. According to the discourse of the text, our existence is bound to action, and to be alive is to live in relationship with our environment. The quality of our mind will determine not only the way we behave and relate, but will be the filter through which we perceive the world external to us. The critical piece that we overlook is that our current inner state is what shapes what we become as individuals and as societies. The yoga tradition has long studied the mind and designed techniques which provide greater insights into its working. Such knowledge can be revolutionary and empowering to individuals to shift from destructive to constructive behaviors. Thinking anew within the field of yoga studies would include building the infrastructure for the egalitarian access to yoga practices and yoga therapy, which can help individuals and societies to heal and restore their health and well-being. Social change begins with the individual and ripples outwards. Perhaps thinking anew within the field of yoga studies should include a reframing of self-care as care for all. This reframing supports the individual to consider how their actions impact the whole and challenge the scholar to consider how their work can implement positive social change for the larger society. It could be argued that thinking anew is another way of conceptualizing beginner's mind. Although yoga itself could be understood as the process of deconstructing conditioned experience in order for the mind to be free of past impressions, for many practitioners, that process is a work in progress. In other words, to think anew begins with recognizing and acknowledging that the scholar is starting their work with a conditioned mind, organized by its past experiences, belief systems, and which operates within the limits of those conditions. This starting point recognizes that the scholar is not all-knowing, nor superior to the subject being studied. The scholar is merely a participant in the process of making meaning of what was, and perhaps their research contributes insights to the complexities of what is happening in our world today. Furthermore, the visionary scholar in the field of yoga studies has the opportunity to apply their academic research to support the psychophysiological and spiritual health and well-being of individuals and societies, a vision of a holistic and inclusive becoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And then we can move on to you can pose your two discussion questions. And we'll have that little 8-minute discussion afterwards, and we'll go to Bianca Gray next. Yeah.
Okay, so do you want me to just verbally ask those questions, Braden?
Yeah, if he wants to. Yeah.
Okay. Because otherwise, I guess I could put them in the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'll put them in the chat, and then you can verbalize them right here, and I'll put them in the chat for everybody. Okay.
Okay.
One at a time. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So one question would be, with yoga evolving from a spiritual discipline to a practice often centered around physical health, how can thinking anew help us reintegrate the broader dimension of yoga, including its mental, social, and spiritual aspects? Can this reintegration address current societal challenges or health crises?
And then if you would like to answer any questions, feel free to raise your hand, use the raise hand function on Zoom, and then I'll call on you. Or if you have questions and don't want to respond to one of the discussion questions, also feel free to do that as well. Yes, Seraphina?
Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think one of the things that really struck me is the second you said it, I went, oh, that's so true. When you said beginner's mind as a way of connecting to our whole theme of thinking anew or reimagining something. Because I love that reframing, and that beginner's mind is not, I think sometimes the surface level interpretation of that is starting from scratch or starting with nothing, when it's really about opening ourselves up to possibility and beginning again and discovering something new. So I just thought that connected so well with our theme and this idea that we are embracing emergence and not yet knowing, because you also said we might leave with more questions than answers. So I think that really, beginner's mind, it feels like it really captured the essence of what you're sharing. And I also really liked how you were saying that we have all these different understandings of what yoga is, but either way, it always requires our body. And I think sometimes, because my context is teaching yoga in mental health settings, sometimes in that setting, people who are doing the programming for treatment and trying to think of what they want to offer clients for their well-being, they think, well, we can offer an asana class or a restorative practice to help their physical relaxation at the end of the day, relieve tension, or we can offer mindfulness meditation or maybe some kind of breath work to target more mental benefits and cultivate self-awareness or a deeper connection to self. When really, we should be providing asana classes that can also integrate moments for reflection and self-awareness. And we don't meditate or breathe without our bodies. Our physical selves are still there. That's not solely a mental practice or a practice with only mental benefits. So I think it's really important that you highlight the holistic view of the practice, because there are these different dimensions that you say, social, spiritual, physical, and those different dimensions are not separate or isolated. And so that's one thing that I feel thinking anew in this area can help us hold on to, that all those dimensions, they don't just exist apart from one another, but that we need to integrate them. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate all of that insight. I think that's, again, a part of tension and of evolving anything is that, there's the question of maintaining integrity, and yet recognizing that nothing is static. And I think that when you start to kind of look at the scope of yoga's evolution, it was always evolving and changing. And I think for where we are today in the world, I think the world is demanding us, as Dr. Stone was, kind of mentioning there at the end of his opening remarks of, the world is demanding our attention. I think the world is very much asking us to do something. And I think the work that we're doing at least in the field that I exist in, it seems that it has now become a time that it is requiring the practitioner to really consider the extension of the practice, and that it's really, if nothing else, I think so often we can feel helpless in the light of the distress that the world can be in, and it can feel hopeless that we can do anything about it. But what we can do is we can regulate ourselves if we have the basic resources available to us to do that. And the more that the single individual can be doing a little bit of self-regulation, that is a gift to everyone else around them. And that is the social effect, is that rippling effect. And I suppose that the question that always comes back to me is as asking ourselves, why do we do anything that we do, and if we're not sure, then maybe that deserves a little bit more of our attention, because we really are very powerful beings, and we can see with all of the destruction we cause, what would it look like if we put some of that energy in the other direction? Braden.
Yeah, so I had actually a comment that your presentation evoked was a comment on, you were talking like just having the academic approach and just having the practice approach. This is tied to your second question, practitioner-scholar debate. The paper highlights the tension between experiential practice and academic study of yoga. How does the concept of thinking anew apply to this debate? Can there be a synthesis that honors both the experiential wisdom of practitioners and the analytical depth of scholars? And what might this look like in practice? This is echoing similar tensions within philosophy, within, where I'm in, at least in the history of philosophy, echoing some tensions between like empiricists and rationalists, or the continental and the analytic philosopher. These are very like two major traditions currently, the analytic and the continental, but in the past modern period, there's rationalists, empiricists, and it was always between experience and, like reason, or something along those terms. And you mentioned a call for deconstruction of tropes and recognizing these biases. This is another thing I'm kind of seeing. I'm in the continental French philosophy class, as you know, with Dr. Stone. So a lot of that is this deconstructing through, well, and at least in the context of that class, there's two methodologies for this deconstruction process that you mentioned within the philosophical context. It's archaeology and genealogy, and it's a kind of historical critical method of, for genealogy, it's discovering the invention. But anyway, I won't get too much into it, but I'm seeing these abstract parallels between the two disciplines, and I'd be interested to see if one thing that worked for one would also work for the other, to see what kinds of discussions are being had in one, how those might have effects in the other if we implement them. But yeah, that was just a comment I had. And then I also had one other thing. This is also for the audience to participate in. So the audience, it's not just for us. Audience can also feel free to raise your hand and then answer some of these questions if you are being provoked to do so. Yeah, thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
And then Dr. Stone, yeah.
Yeah, since I'm a host, I don't have a raise hand function. Megan, this was a marvelous paper. I wanted to indeed address your second question, because I think there are certain parallels, particularly for people who do scholarship centering around like grassroots organizations and activist groups. That's quite similar, and I hadn't thought of it until hearing your talk and the way you phrased this question. In those settings, one of the things we're nervous about as academics is you don't want to go into a group of practitioners and tell them how to do the thing they've been doing, usually longer than we've been doing the scholarship on it. And sometimes there's a kind of hubris by the academic side of things to say, now I can tell you what you're doing. I think the way out of that is to say, let us have the task of the academy to observe what you're doing and try to put that inside of the grid of intelligibility already, for example, in the academy. Meanwhile, the flip side of that is no scholarship on yoga or on activism or any of these practitioner-based activities can be done without those communities. And we still see way too many scholars writing on groups of people, writing on these practices, having never spoken to a single practitioner. Or imagine writing an academic piece on yoga and having never done any of it. And as hilarious as that sounds in the yoga case, it's actually quite common in the academy to write about things without any connection to experience. So when Braden talks about experience and reason, that's what I think of. One of the things I think yoga studies has actually exemplified is that you have to practice and theorize. So you can better practice, you have an informed practice, but also then a research and scholarship that's informed by the actual practices being done. And I think that's a really important thing. It's really hard to be in the ivory tower in yoga studies. And that's something all disciplines, I think, could learn from as we see it in yoga.
I agree. And I personally, for me, as a practitioner of multiple decades at this point, I feel that it is such an exciting time, because I think that what we're seeing today with this rising of more practitioner scholars is that it's a lot of folks that have done the practice for a long time, very serious about it, and yet can recognize that within the popular form of yoga, there is a lot of misunderstanding, and it perpetuates a lot of harm and a lot of insensitivity to understanding culture and context and history. And I think that's what some folks are attempting to do. And I would hope that would be the direction that the scholarship continues to go in.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Megan, again for your presentation. Little applaud for you. Next, we have Bianca Gray going to be presenting on her paper. So you can take it away, Bianca.
Thank you, Braden. So, hi, my name is Bianca, and thank you for coming this evening. I'm going to be presenting on my paper, Old Dogs, New Tongues, The Problem with Language in the Classroom. So, one of the easiest ways to subjugate a group is to rob them of their mother tongue. As students progress throughout K-12, they are indoctrinated into the idea of there being a correct and incorrect way of speaking in academic settings. By the time students enter higher education, most have no intentions of altering that mindset. There are more obvious rules of academic language, but there are more minute details that are typically discussed and gone over with students in their first year composition classes. In the 3-part 2009 series, What Should Colleges Teach?, Stanley Fish, a literary theorist and legal scholar, started an incredible discourse surrounding what college students should and should not learn in their college composition classrooms. Most notably, in the 3rd part of his series, he argues against the claim that students have the right to their language for fear that students will fail in the world outside the classroom, where language and methods of communication are heavily scrutinized and may make them susceptible to prejudice. Dr. Rashawn Young, an educator of Black American disciplines and scholarly studies, disagreed with Fish's sentiments in his own work, Should Writers Use They Own English? Young states in response to societal scrutinies of language, don't nobody's language, dialect, or style make them vulnerable to prejudice. It's attitudes. Dr. Young argues in favor of a classroom that incorporates code meshing, or the blending of dialects, international languages, local idioms, chat room lingo, and the rhetorical styles of various ethnic and cultural groups in both formal and informal speech acts. Though there is validity in both arguments of Fish and Young, both fail to take into account that first-year college students are not blank slates. They have already established their views on language both in and outside the classroom, partially due to their experience in secondary education. And it's difficult to teach old dogs new tongues, regardless of which teaching methods academia believes to be correct or incorrect. So my research has examined both the arguments of Fish and Young to establish a common ground between the two and work towards developing a teaching program that incorporates both standard English and code meshing so that students will be more accepting of learning new dialects and being comfortable with their own language. So let's start by looking in depth at the arguments presented by both Fish and Young separately and the context surrounding them before determining concrete ways to mesh them together. As stated prior, What Should Colleges Teach was a three-part series published in the New York Times in 2009. Sparked by Fish's grad students' inability to write a quote-unquote clean sentence, part one of the series focuses on Fish's belief that college composition classes use language, grammar, and rhetoric only. During the 2000s, writing composition classes were seeing shifts in the way they approached engaging students with material, due in part to Peter Elbow's publication of Inviting the Mother Tongue, Beyond Mistakes, Bad English, and Wrong Language. In the article, Elbow argues in favor of honoring the individual dialects of students and letting them write in their native tongues before pushing them towards standard written English. He argues that the classroom should be a safe space where students are free of outside worries. Along with the writing composition classes movement towards becoming a safe space for all dialects, many instructors began incorporating different hot button issues in their class discussions to help guide their writing, such as racism, homophobia, the war on terror, and whatever other issue you can think of that causes discord, something that Fish argues against as he feels it muddles the subject. Stanley Fish states, I conclude that unless writing courses focus exclusively on writing, they are a sham, and I advise administrators to insist that all courses listed as courses in composition teach grammar and rhetoric and nothing else. Admittedly, my first time reading the series in full made me want to run to the comment section and voice my disagreement, though the comment section had already been turned off. After a second and third read of the material, I was able to fully flesh out my thoughts and what Fish had presented and fully engage with the content. Nothing of any real substance is added to the discourse in part 2 of the series, so I just move on to part 3. And it is in part 3 of the series that Fish begins to discuss language by name. Most notably, he states, first, you must clear your mind of the orthodoxies that have been held in the composition world. We affirm students' rights to their patterns and varieties of language, the dialects of their nurture, or whatever dialects in which they find their own identity and style. So Fish's views on English are monolithic. He doesn't consider the fact that language is constantly evolving and that teaching of language should adapt with the times. He treats other variants of English as if they're lesser than standard written English by fighting adamantly against their space in the classroom. Is the purpose of communication not to convey a message? If so, why is there such an issue with how that message is being conveyed, even though there's an understanding of what is being said? The issue, as highlighted prior, isn't the dialect itself, but how that dialect is perceived. And it is here that Dr. Vershawn Young enters the conversation with his famed work, Should Writers Use Their Own English? Dr. Young writes this work entirely in African American Vernacular English, or AAVE for short. I find it important, though, to note that most Black people that I know in my life, my family included, do not refer to our language as African American Vernacular English. My family actually calls me uppity when I name it as such. They only ever refer to our language as Ebonics. But that being said, the primary goal of Young's paper is for his idea of code meshing to be accepted as the new standard written English. First, Dr. Young dismantles the notion of dominant language ideologies, a term he defines as peeps can say whatever the heck they want, however they want, but at home. Though there have been pushes against the belief of dominant language ideology, it still runs rampant throughout academia. In Fish's article, he gives his take on students' right to their own language. He states, and if students infected with the facile egalitarianism or soft multiculturalism declare, I have a right to my own language, reply, yes, you do, and I'm not here to take that language from you. I'm here to teach you another one. Who could object to learning a second language? The issue that Young takes with this method, as do I, is that though it is well-intentioned, it treats different dialects of English as though they are completely foreign and not the same as standard written English. He's not teaching students a different language. He's teaching them that there is something inherently unacceptable about the way they speak, proving Young's earlier mentioned point that it is not the language itself, but the attitudes towards that language. Young introduces us to code meshing, a method of teaching writing that incorporates the different English dialects as well as the other language cultures that may exist within the classroom. Young states on code meshing that it is the new code switching. It is multi-dialectalism, it is plural lingualism in one speech act in one paper. He asserts that people in positions of power already actively engage in code meshing, altering their method of communication to fit the target audience. This differs from code switching, as code switching is done more so to appease the audience, while code meshing is done to further drive home a point to the audience. Students would be able to reserve the right to their language while engaging in academic discourse, effectively blending the two methods of speech. Though I find my stance aligning more with Dr. Young's, I worry about how his ideology would work when executed. During my final 2 years in undergrad, I served as a tutor and student teacher for first-year writing classes at Rowan University. I was hired through the university's writing center and was assigned to serve as a tutor for 2 classes a semester. My responsibilities for the class were to host weekly hour-long sessions in groups of 4 or 5 and go over different strategies for approaching writing, go over student essays, and or use the time as an independent study hall for students to complete work. Young and Fish's articles were taught in majority of the first-year writing classes. In the classes where I served as tutor, students were asked to read a third part of Fish's series first, followed by Young's response. They were then tasked with writing an essay where they entered the conversation and offered their viewpoints on how language should be taught in the classroom. I find it imperative to mention the racial demographics of Rowan University. It is as follows: 67.4% white, 11.5% Hispanic, 9.8% Black, 5.7% Asian, 3.7% multi-ethnic, and the rest is unknown or other. These demographics were reflected in the classes I tutored, with the majority of the students being predominantly white and the minority of students being of color. When reading student essays or discussing both articles, I often took note of how the majority of students of all races usually wrote their essays in favor of Fish, despite the material being taught in favor of Young, as well as many of the students speaking in dialects that Fish would deem inappropriate for the classroom. One young lady even referred to Dr. Young's manner of speech as not normal. I don't believe the issue to have been the material itself, but how it was presented to the students, but by not only the instructor, but by myself as the tutor. As tutors, we received about 2 hours of training on translingualism and different language practices that were meant to guide us on how we would help not only the students understand the language in the classroom, but also ourselves. Though it was well-intentioned, 2 hours isn't going to reverse what years of schooling has instilled in me and these students about language in the classroom. It'd be foolish to think so. It is for this reason that I work towards pursuing a classroom that incorporates both the ideologies of Fish and Young. Despite their opposing methods of teaching, Fish and Young are in agreement with one issue. A portion of college composition classes needs to spend time focusing strictly on the mechanics of writing. The best solution towards mending the ideologies of Young and Fish would be instituting an American dialects course titled American Dialects for Writing for students to take in their first year of college. The American dialects class would be responsible for teaching the mechanics of writing, grammar, and rhetoric while facilitating lessons on the different American English dialects, such as African American Vernacular English, Spanglish, the Southern dialects, as well as standard written English. Fluency Corp, a company responsible for providing language training for different companies globally, reports that there are 30 different dialects in America, meaning there is no limit to the avenues a professor could take while teaching not only these methods of communication, but how they could be developed. A possible first assignment for students would be to write a short paper written entirely in the dialect they feel most comfortable with, abandoning the restrictions of academic writing. This would allow students to write with a carefreeness that they probably haven't experienced since their early schooling, while also allowing the professor to see the different dialects that exist in the classroom. Despite what Fish and Young may think, I believe issues outside the classroom prove to be a great source of inspiration when it comes to writing and would further engage the students in writing, especially those who don't feel as though writing is their strong suit. I'd suggest instituting these classes at small liberal arts colleges first and seeing how students and faculty respond to this course before instituting them at larger universities. If the class is not well received, then necessary updates will be made to the material and how the course is run before trying it out again. I believe that it is difficult to teach old dogs new tricks, and in this case, new tongues. Many students are set in their ways and aren't interested in changing, not due to laziness or disinterest, but because they are accustomed to classrooms running one way and only one way, and thoughts of change can be foreboding for anybody. However, if there is a course that focuses entirely on this change and teaches its conventions, the students may be more receptive to receiving the information. By changing how we teach language in the classroom, we are directly impacting the viewpoints and understandings of people who will one day be in positions of power and who will hopefully do more to dismantle previous small-minded ideas of language and how it is treated. So thank you. That is my essay. And then Brandon helped me I mean, Braden helped me come up with the questions. And do I post them in the chat or do you?
I've already posted them, so they are there.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Stone.
Wonderful. Well, I'm thinking about it. If people who are in the symposium want to use the chat function to respond to things, of course, that's because we're talking about different ways to participate in things. The chat function, of course, is available in Zoom, and we can then respond to things in the chat as well. I was particularly enjoying how Jesuit, on the one hand, your presentation is. On the one hand, yes, writing, and on the other hand, speaking. And of course, when I think dialect, because I've been well trenched into the idea that we oddly are supposed to write differently than we talk, but we also then sometimes tell people not to talk a certain way either. And so what gets jeopardized is a student's ability to express oneself and communicate from their own authentic self. And so I really do like this idea of the American dialects course on the one hand, because it's kind of your standard English composition. But here at LMU, we have this thing called rhetorical arts, which is founded on the Jesuit principle of eloquentia perfecta. Now, all the old debates will still appear in the sense of what it means to speak perfectly. But there would be something about every student feeling comfortable in writing and in speaking to be able to say their ideas. And so I think that's just a very powerful way for people to authentically enter conversations in the world. And if we could train them how to do that, then they'll be able in their life to have more authentic communications with other people. And I think that's the big sell for these students. So it's not so much that they feel validated in the sense of, well, my dialect is being represented, but I have the confidence and comfort to express myself in whatever way I would normally do that. And part of the faculty responsibility, I guess, would be to help encourage. So it wouldn't be making sure that students use Ebonics. I grew up in that generation too. Use it perfectly. There are rules to it, but we're not trying to correct their African-American vernacular English grammar. Rather, that we encourage students to express themselves and not care in the immediate moment about, whether the dialect fits a certain model or not, but just get ideas out there. Then there will be an incentive, dare I say, to want to write in a certain way or speak in a certain way. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. Looks like, is it Catalina?
Yes. Are you able
Okay,
to hear?
perfect.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
cool.
we can hear you.
Love the paper, Bianca. I think it's such a splendid idea. And as another rhetorical arts instructor, just like yourself, it's such an important conversation, especially where we're intercepting these students at this moment in time and recognizing, you're right, that they're not blank slates. They have come in to this point with so much knowledge, and how do we meet the students where we're at is also breaking down our own understanding of what the first year student is and where they come from. But I was also thinking too, how your class, as you imagine it, I want to think too how we can incorporate American Sign Language into the ways that we shift our understanding of what is considered oral speaking as well. The fact that we may have some students of different abilities in our classroom, and if we embrace American dialects in a written and oral way that's requires the like the voice and the way that I'm able to speak with volumes, but there are other means of expression that are also completely legitimate and valid. It's not like we can consider American Sign Language in like modern languages, because doesn't seem like sign language has a place yet in American institutions, especially higher education. And so your class might be a way that we invite those different kinds of expression that incorporate and accept and acknowledge those different kinds of abilities in the classroom. So I don't know, it's a great idea. Thought it was lovely.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. First, like, what's crazy? I didn't even think about American Sign Language until you just said it in this moment. And that is crazy how we don't even consider people with disabilities sometimes. So I think, yes, the course could 100% be developed to incorporate that more, because it is a life skill and it's more inclusive. So thank you.
All right, we have enough time to take one more question, and then we'll move on.
So Patrick.
Great, thanks. Really love this paper. I was thinking, this whole time you were speaking, I'm sure it made all of us think about our own fields in our own ways. But I kept thinking about just in philosophy, for example, we have many people who even just write in British English, especially in like the 80s and the 70s. I'm sure Dr. Stone and Braden will be familiar with this. And it's nearly, to me, like I struggle to, it requires interpretation, and it requires kind of it doesn't flow as effortlessly as the predominantly styled at least English that I'm used to. And I know that's not a perfect analogy, but I always just think it's like if we could tolerate the sometimes the different standards of British English and English in Australia, and again, it's there are standards here, but sometimes I'm hopeful too, but there's no really loss in terms of communicability, and so I'm this is just a way of agreeing with you, and I'm if there's anyone who's reluctant to accept other alternate forms of dialect, I would like to show them all the examples of just the immense variety of English as it's as it's spoken around the world, and from other languages. And yeah, so sorry for that rambling, but I just wanted to express, and I was curious maybe if you had any additional thoughts or something. Yeah.
No, thank you. You know what's actually crazy? I have a student this semester who he actually speaks British English. Um, and just seeing like how his writing differs from other students, it maybe another professor would kind of mark him down for certain things, but I'm like, well, no, that's how he speaks. I also have two students who their first language is Spanish, and whenever we break out in groups, they speak to each other in Spanish. And I've noticed like with other people I've talked to, they say, oh, you should tell them not to. And I'm like, well, why? Like, they're not, I should be encouraging their language and how they speak, because like you were getting at, it's like there's so many different ways that language exists around us. So we can't, I feel like, to put like a cap on it and to tell some students, no, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. Why? We're just indoctrinating them into the systems that we hated growing up, so we don't want to become a part of the system. We want to change it, identify problems, and change it. So thank you so much for your thoughts, Patrick.
All right, thank you so much, guys. Next, we have Seraphina Blake, going to be presenting her paper. So take it away, Seraphina.
Thank you. So my name is Seraphina, and my paper is called Hearts on Fire, Reimagining LGBTQ Pastoral Accompaniment Through Synodal Spirituality. The Catholic Church's current Synod on Synodality is a 3-year journey that many consider to be the largest attempt at human consultation in church history. Pope Francis stated in 2013 that to hold a synod means to walk together. I think this is truly the most wonderful experience we can have, to belong to a people walking, journeying through history together with their Lord who walks among us. More than simply a series of meetings and listening sessions, the 2021-2024 Synod is shaped by a spirituality for synodality. Synod as a spiritual practice centers deep listening and journeying together, as well as the extension of love and sharing towards those who have been left behind by the dominant church. In the spirit of inclusion, the church is currently asking, how can we create spaces where those who have been marginalized and made to feel unwelcome, for example, women, the LGBTQ community, and people with disabilities, feel recognized and free to ask questions? Ultimately, synodal spirituality is open to discovering and co-creating an environment where all can experience true belonging. Towards a Spirituality for Synodality, a document prepared by the members of the Commission on Spirituality subgroup, notes that synodal listening is receptive listening. We must receive others and their contributions with generosity and humility. In doing so, the goal is that we are becoming a listening church, not only so that we listen more deeply to one another, but so that we live out the Christian belief that the Holy Spirit speaks through the people of God. In what ways do we listen to others, but fail to fully embrace what they're sharing? At the opening of the synodal path in 2021, Pope Francis asked, "Are we good at listening? How good is the hearing of our heart?" Towards a Spirituality for Synodality also draws on the metaphor of the heart to express the importance of unconditional care for all created beings. The document quotes Saint Isaac the Syrian, who wrote, "What is a merciful or compassionate heart? It is a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for all that exists." Synodal spirituality is undergirded by this awareness that we must open ourselves to burn with love for all people, all beings. This is an act which must be embodied wholeheartedly if it is to be in harmony with God's purpose for creation. Although the Synod is still ongoing, there is already evidence that its work is blossoming as pastoral leaders begin to rethink their approach to LGBTQ pastoral accompaniment and inclusion. In October 2023, the Diocese of Davenport in Iowa published Guidelines for Pastoral Accompaniment of Sexual and Gender Minorities, which seeks to provide basic guidance on how to accept sexual and gender minorities in a way that is pastorally sensitive, practical, and faithful to the Church's teachings on sexuality and the nature of the human person. Queer theologians and advocates for LGBTQ Catholics have uplifted this document for its expressed desire to respect the dignity of the whole person, mind, body, and soul. Additionally, it emphasizes that the Church must move past an us versus them dichotomy and treat all people as members of one human family. While these guidelines demonstrate positive steps in the right direction, they are unfortunately still oriented by the perspective that members of the LGBTQ community are somehow outsiders who pose a problem that the Church and pastoral leaders must resolve. In doing so, the writers of this document perpetuate the very issue of otherizing that they desire to transcend. The guidelines were written as a response to society and the Church becoming increasingly aware of people who experience differences in sexual orientation or gender discordance. Further, the writers state that how we are called to love them most authentically in our parishes and other institutions is where questions and challenges can arise. Some queer theologies might utilize apologetic approaches to respond to these statements and defend or argue for the inclusion of LGBTQ Christians in the Church. However, I propose that a non-apologetic approach is more effective and life-giving. A non-apologetic approach to queer theology does not seek to apologize for or defend the inclusion of LGBTQ Christians in the Church, because it recognizes that queer and trans people are and always have been a significant part of faith communities and the trajectory of the Church for as long as it has existed. By moving past apologetics, there is a new opportunity to celebrate and uplift the existing queer and trans members of the body of Christ and highlight their significant contributions and unique theological gifts. Once we have moved beyond arguing for the inclusion of a community that is already present, we can shift our focus to supporting the flourishing and thriving of all LGBTQ people. In his encyclical letter Laudato Si, published in 2015, Pope Francis calls for an integral ecology, an urging to recognize the interconnectedness of all things for the care of our common home. He writes that we must view climate change as a problem with serious implications for the environment, but also for the social, cultural, economic, and political dimensions of life. He advocates for an integrative and holistic approach to environmental care to broaden our vision and transcend a traditional view which splits these varied issues off into their respective categories. Pope Francis writes, "It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. The fragmentation of knowledge and the isolation of bits of information can actually become a form of ignorance unless they are integrated into a broader vision of reality." Through the lens of interconnectedness offered in Laudato Si, we can both situate synodal spirituality in the context of the entire planet and also begin to approach the pastoral accompaniment of LGBTQ people more holistically and integrally. Pastoral accompaniment is a term used to describe a form of pastoral care in which there is a mutual reciprocal relationship between the caregiver and the person being cared for. Much like the synodal process itself, the Jesuit view of accompaniment emphasizes a relationship in which people walk together, at the same time, neither too far ahead nor behind. The mutuality of such a relationship is not intended to erase diversity or diminish the pastoral leader's capabilities. Rather, accompaniment is an experience that shines a light on the treasures of differences between people. What does it mean to utilize an integral ecological approach with regards to LGBTQ pastoral accompaniment? Any attempt to reimagine ministry for queer and trans people requires us to recognize that the liberation and flourishing of all LGBTQ people means the liberation and flourishing of all of us. The Diocese of Davenport's guidelines suggest those in ministerial roles have the responsibility to learn how to accept and love people in marginalized sexuality and gender groups, and also provide case-by-case approaches or accommodations that meet their needs. Among the recommended questions in the guidelines are, what brings them to you? What is their concern or request? And what expertise or experience do you bring to the table? These are questions which perpetuate the dichotomy between the servers and the served. They lack a sense of mutual reciprocity. Without seeking to celebrate the differences between people, these questions view the LGBTQ person as an issue which must be solved, forgetting that they have their own expertise about themselves, their own unique gifts and strengths, and a multitude of inner resources given to them by God. Within these guidelines is also the heteronormative assumption that only cisgender heterosexual males in ministerial roles provide pastoral accompaniment to LGBTQ persons. A revitalization of accompaniment can not only disrupt the server-served dichotomy, which is common in many traditional views of ministry, but it can also highlight the gifts and strengths that queer and trans people already contribute. Embracing reciprocity and mutuality, queer and trans people are also providing accompaniment to pastoral caregivers too. Towards the Spirituality for Synodality references the venerated icon, Mary, Mother of God, as the Hodegetria, the one who shows the way. Mary accompanies the Church on its synodal journey, pointing out the way for the whole of humanity, searching for healing and the fullness of life. In what ways do our queer and trans siblings contribute their theological gifts to the Church, showing the way to God and to love, embodying radical courage, compassion, and an embrace of one's evolution and becoming? I argue that the very existence of LGBTQ people within the Church and our open acknowledgement of this is vital to the synodal path of belonging and journeying together. In his devotional book, Hearts Ablaze, Parables for the Queer Soul, Rolf Nolasco describes queer and trans voices not simply as hearers, but as co-interpreters with the living word. He also writes that the very passages in the Bible used as weapons to harm the queer spirit can be seen as a source of subversion and resistance to ignite our hearts and keep them ablaze, torches that illumine the path for personal and collective queer liberation. With our hearts on fire, burning with love and compassion for all of creation, we can follow the path lit ahead as we stay connected to the need for transformation, personally, interpersonally, and collectively. Nolasco also expresses the power of queer joy and its transformative, sustaining, and healing nature. He describes joy as more than just a feeling. It is a whole body experience. He writes that queer joy is not merely a pleasant state when things are better than expected. It also infuses creativity, imagination, and affiliation as a ready response to current and future challenges and obstacles. It does not wash away the complications and complex emotions that rise up in our quest for social justice, belonging, and flourishing, but transforms these emotions into something much more subversive and threatening to the dominant group. Queer joy is a non-apologetic approach to queer theology, and in the framework of an integral ecology, can also influence a life well lived for everyone, not just queer and trans people. Joy, as Audre Lorde writes, is a form of energy for change. And as Nolasco reminds us, queer joy is an imaginative, generative power, one which is necessary for the whole community to learn how to embrace and advocate for change in creative, innovative ways without depleting our bodies and spirits. Queer joy is both the fire igniting our next move forward and a healing balm, offering a hopeful vision for the future. Synodal spirituality is about listening, yet it is also about being bold, fearless, and free. The synodal call to speak and act with parrhesia is one that Pope Francis has promoted emphatically, repeating time and time again that parrhesia is a gift from God, prompting us to be courageous and tell the truth. Father Brian Massengale recently stated that the work of justice requires us to be truth tellers. LGBTQ people accompany the church by holding, beholding, and sharing their queer joy, their truthfulness to who they are, and their embrace of parrhesia as a call that is simultaneously risky and freeing. It is important to hold the paradox that we've made progress regarding the treatment of LGBTQ people in the church, and still there is a lot of work to do. It's tempting to become discouraged or to disregard the Synod or the Diocese of Davenport's new guidelines, skeptical that real change may never occur. At the same time, we must remember that reimagining the pastoral accompaniment of LGBTQ people and uplifting queer joy has ramifications beyond the Catholic Church. As Pope Francis reminds us in Laudato Si', everything, all systems are interconnected. The mutuality and reciprocity inherent to accompaniment, which comes when we highlight queer joy, recognizing LGBTQ people and their existing presence and contributions in the church, is therefore good news for everyone. There is a flourishing of the whole community that is only possible when we approach accompaniment in this integrative, joy-centered way. Now more than ever, our uplifting of queer joy, parrhesia, and fearless truth-telling will become the guiding beacons that unveil our synodal path forward. Thank you.
So much, Seraphina. I posted all the her two discussion questions in the chat for everyone to see. So those are there.
Okay, great. So yeah, the first question is, what are the possibilities for uplifting queer joy as a non-apologetic approach to celebrating the full inclusion of LGBTQ people within your own faith community or academic discipline? So in other words, what might uplifting queer joy look like in a practical sense within your own context? And the second question is, how might our open acknowledgement of queer and trans people's existing presence and contributions in the church shape our efforts towards LGBTQ inclusion?
I have a comment as an observer here. I just really appreciate how these talks are complementing each other. There was a phrase that you used, Seraphina, something with respect to collective connection to the need for transformation. I think kind of was the motif there, and we're seeing that. I mean, from Megan's presentation with respect to the societal exchanges and the potential there between the dualistic and non-dualistic histories of yoga and the health, physical aspects and spiritual aspects. And then also with respect to language, how we need to transform ideas into text and be more responsible in terms of how we're listening to those texts. I think there's a really wonderful blend that I see across all the talks. So I just wanted to say that.
Safari doesn't want to open.
Yes, Dr. Stone.
Yes, one thing I really like about this paper is you remind us again and again that the church could model something for non-church purposes. And I like, in your first question, you talk about how academic disciplines can do the work as well. But it's one more example. When the church is participating in less than optimal behaviors, this gives excuse in certain cases to people because, hey, the church is condoning this negative behavior, hatred for others, and things like that. But I like how you have challenged us in this paper to say, well, church, let's do it because it would model behavior for others and in other contexts. And so going back to actually Megan's paper, right, this distinction between, in theology, between orthopraxis and orthodoxy, where, on the one hand, there's kind of the beliefs we hold, and then there's the, how are we supposed to live and be an exemplar of justice, love, righteousness, and all those things. And so I just really like the way that you call on the church to do something, not so much merely for its own sake, but because the church could be the biggest agent, at least in the West, as it were, in the Christian West, the biggest agent to help solve the crisis of homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, and things like that. And so that call to the church to be an exemplar, I just find it really powerful. It sounded more powerful as you read the paper compared to if I was just reading it like on the page. There's something about the way you prophesied, for lack of a better term, in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Seraphina. I was also wanting to mention I appreciated the how I was actually going to comment on the same thing about how the church is supposed to model. It's supposed to be to use the biblical concept of the city on a hill, leading by example, in other words, for the society that it's in. And I think if that's actually one of the church's goal, then it has to think critically about how it actually lives these things out and what society would look like if they if they kind of took what they were working with within the church and expanded upon it into the larger context of society. What would that look like? How would that marginalize certain people, or how would that affect certain people, or how would that uplift certain people? Literally being a city on a hill. But Yeah, so I just wanted to comment on that and also thank you for the presentation. We're at the time now where we have to switch to Patrick's, but if anybody else has any more questions, we do still have the 30-minute discussion at the very end. So yeah, so next we can go on to Patrick Hall presenting his paper from philosophy. Okay, take it away, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. I first, I have to thank my friends and my professors because I could not have made this paper. So I'm going to thank some people. I have to thank David McCullough, Annika Chen, Grace Calvelage, Zach Schroeder, my friend Mauricio Yaragui, Shet Milchek, Dr. Eric Pearl, Dr. Marcelo Garcia Romero, Dr. Daniel Speak, Dr. Christopher Kaiser, and Dr. Brad Stone, and many more people who have helped me think through this issue. Not that they necessarily agree with me on these issues, but that's the great thing about philosophy. But anyway, here is my paper. Philosophy, as it has been practiced in much of the English-speaking world has for so long been lost. It has become splintered within itself and alienated from one of its central epistemic resources, the character and power of thought itself, where an epistemic resource is a resource we can use to access knowledge. Scholarship of great quality is rendered insignificant by a growing tendency towards siloing, making it impossible for philosophers to create work that can progress the discipline as a whole. Any hope of aiming towards a unified project and asserting its deserved epistemic authority is hopeless unless philosophy can consolidate intellectual support around the critical thesis that thinking delivers truth. It is this thesis alone which can justify the practice of philosophy, or any other discipline within BCLA, I would argue, and I do think all of our disciplines are united on this point. This is how we must think anew in philosophy, by returning to thinking itself. There are two related qualities of thinking which make it unique as a mode of inquiry: its intentionality and its what I'm calling unboundedness. By intentionality, I'm referring to the transitive character of thought. Thinking is always of something, always aiming at some content. Thinking without an object of thought is no longer thinking. That is, to think about nothing is not to think at all. The same is true of sight. Seeing is always of something seen. Sorry. Yes. Even in closing our eyes, there is still visual content, something for sight to behold, even if it is just darkness. Analogously, as attempting to think about nothing only shifts the content of thought towards a different object, like the nullity of space. But again, insofar as we can describe what's left in thought's gaze as the nullity of space, we still think of something. The unboundedness refers to the nature of the intentional content of thought, the nature of the things we can think of. This unbounded aspect of intentional thought is so powerful because it somehow allows us to attend to realities absent from us, or rather has the ability to make the absent present to our consciousness. This is evident even in the rudimentary act of memory or mathematical addition. When we think about remembered events, we return to the past in an admittedly imperfect, though nevertheless non-arbitrary fashion. If we admit that our memories, while fallible, at least capture some reality of the past, we are already halfway towards accepting a set of unpopular views in contemporary philosophy, as well as the broader intellectual community. And in the case of addition, we can access a truth which is itself not a spatial truth, not something that we could necessarily analyze by measuring something. I'm thinking of the addition 2 + 2 = 4, and that addition fact is eternal. It will never not be false. It will always be true. And thinking alone can grasp this fact. Part of understanding why philosophy and the liberal arts, I would say, are in crisis requires first understanding why the wider intellectual environment is as well, for they are not unrelated. Both philosophy and the Anglophone intellectual community have been deeply influenced by a doctrine known as positivism, which broadly understood contends that the only epistemic claims worth paying attention to are those which can be demonstrated or defended in the form of empirical analyses, like experimentation or observation, or in the form of mathematical formalization, as in statistical analysis. It manifests as an attitude of doubt or distrust towards any supposed inquisitive discipline which does not found its claims on such empirical analysis. This view is utterly corrosive to philosophy and the liberal arts more broadly because thinking, and what I've been calling its intentional unboundedness, is in an important sense a private activity, not observable with empirical instrumentation, only available to the thinker themselves. We cannot see the thinking of others, only an image of thinking, and this image is in the form of language, facial expressions, behavior. In MRI, for example, we do not see the intentional unboundedness of thought, but the physical mechanism which enables it. And well, these are all very controversial ideas in philosophy, but however, and importantly, this does not mean that the content of thought is not, in an important sense, real or legitimate. This doctrine is so pervasive in contemporary discourse that it can be difficult to question. How often have we heard acquaintances, family members, or even tenured faculty dismiss their liberal arts as mere expressions of feeling and sentiment, or as baseless attempts to make sense of a meaningless universe? How often are individual neurotransmitters now invoked to explain away the qualitative aspect to our emotion, as if the love we feel for our partners can be reduced to a heightened presence of dopamine in our brains, or any other sophisticated cocktail of biochemicals? Clearly, they play a role in our lives and our intellectual lives, but our cognitive activity, and most notably intellectual intentionality and its unboundedness, cannot be exhausted by reference to biochemical processes. The dictum, for example, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder is today welcomed with near universal acceptance because, at least in part, it is not possible to empirically observe beauty. This is because beauty is an irreducibly normative phenomenon, one that invokes a judgment about how the world should be. In the case of beauty, it is a normative judgment about an aesthetic state of affairs, a judgment that the world is better off with things like sunsets or butterflies or all these things. Critically, normative judgments are impossible to assess without first stipulating what beauty or goodness consists in, which the sciences cannot do. What experiment or arithmetic proof could prove once and for all that beauty consists essentially in, say, the symmetry of two figures? Most scientists, and even those who study philosophy like myself, agree that such a task cannot be accomplished because beauty is not a phenomenon perceptible through empirical instrumentation. Many then conclude from this that beauty isn't real, that it isn't a property inherent to the nature of the world, because if it was, we would be able to see it in empirical observation, like in barometers, telescopes, or the Large Hadron Collider or somewhere. So many who readily accept this thesis seem to ignore that by the same token. All moral judgments, too, merely rest in the moral organ of the beholder. The only difference between aesthetic and moral judgments are the domains over which they range. The aesthetic ranges over nature and works of art, broadly speaking, and the moral over the affairs of sentient living things. Both are just species of normative judgments. Again, judgments about the way the world should or ought to be. Judgments which rest on stipulations that we just established are not empirically observable or confirmable. Therefore, if we dismiss the reality of beauty in the world on the basis that it is not empirically observable nor mathematically formalizable, and there is, for those people out there, there is this thing called ontic logic, which does try to formalize ethics, but it does not, and with the content of predicates, it says some moral actions are permissible or obligatory, but it does not say itself what is permissible or obligatory. That happens prior to doing the ontic logic. Look at the implications of this worldview. None of our moral lives contain any reality whatsoever. The moral becomes nothing but a manifestation of subjective emotion. The horrible tragedy of losing a child, say, is not really horrible under this view because there's no such thing as the morally horrible out there in the world. The moral outrage towards injustice is merely a manifestation of our in-group not getting its way. This is the inevitable consequence of the positivist worldview, an untenable opposition between the act and content of thought and the empirically observable real world from which the intellectual emerges. With this worldview, we cannot condemn atrocity, love other persons, or truly understand the world, as I would argue. This is what follows if we surrender the epistemic authority of thought. The other principal problem with positivism is that it is self-defeating. Positivism is not itself an empirically observable or mathematically formalizable thesis. The thesis that the only claims and judgments worth paying attention to, that are the ones observed and confirmed by science, is not itself a thesis that is confirmed or observed by science. The reliability of the sciences is a premise that can be employed in favor of positivism, but the reliability of the sciences cannot be observed and confirmed by the sciences on pain of circular reasoning. Say, oh, I know the sciences are reliable because the sciences tell me they're reliable. Therefore, by its own standards, positivism is not worthy of epistemic attention, all by itself at least. And this gets at an important point. Positivism is not empirically verifiable because it is, and it pains me to admit this, a philosophical thesis, one that makes a claim to the nature of what we can know and what exists. Thinking reaches beyond that which is available to empirical analysis and mathematical formalization. It questions their limits and it seeks to provide them their own foundation. For example, the reliability of scientific instrumentation, which enables empirical analysis, depends on a presupposition of the intelligibility of the physical world. Empirical science cannot aim its instruments at intelligibility itself. Only thought can perform this task. Only thought can recognize that the intelligibility of the world depends upon the play of principles of sameness and difference, of part and whole, of non-contradiction. This way of talking sounds abstract, but that is because I would argue we live in an age of impoverished philosophy, in which we have to articulate ourselves such that we are not called pseudoscientists. And this is exactly what happened this past September. A group of 124 scholars, consisting mostly of psychologists and neuroscientists, but accompanied by a small contingent of philosophers, signed a letter denouncing a principally philosophical theory of consciousness known as information integration theory, or IIT, as pseudoscientific. IIT posits that phenomenal consciousness is nothing but energy, information integrated in a particular way, and with a certain degree of physical complexity. They insist, the signatories of this letter insist that until the theory as a whole is empirically testable, we feel that the pseudoscience label should indeed apply. The unsettling aspect of this letter is its unabashed positivist reasoning. IIT is only to be taken into serious consideration insofar as it can be empirically observable. Otherwise, it's merely pseudoscience, a theory in company with the likes of astrology, alternate medicine, and creationism. For this reason and others, philosophy finds itself in a perilous position as an epistemic authority, for it has more or less quietly allowed the sciences to displace its significance within the intellectual world. I invite the audience to recall the last time they noticed a philosopher treated as an expert on any issue in contemporary discourse. Without a distinct means by which philosophy can investigate the world, i.e. without thought, it is legitimate to wonder what philosophy has to offer that cannot be found in the sciences. And this is where the 124 signatories are not entirely misguided in their critique of IIT. As they mentioned in the letter, IIT has, in fact, been trumpeted by the media, as well as by a share of uncareful philosophers, I would argue, as a theory which will be empirically rigorous and even testable. When philosophers embrace positivism, a view contrary to the core project of philosophy as a discipline, which investigates the world of thought and through thought in its intentional unboundedness, they leave themselves vulnerable to such denunciations. For when they aim for empirical observability and mathematical formalizability, they aim to become a science. As a result of the influence of positivism within philosophy, philosophers resist the metaphysic epistemic commitments necessary to bring all of philosophy's core subdisciplines, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, together. It is not that these subdisciplines produce work of poor quality, nor is it that philosophers working within these subdisciplines do not have their own passionate views about grand theories in philosophy as a whole, but the residual influence of positivism demands that philosophers do not stray far from empirical analysis and formalization, therefore shackling thinking till it can be explained with physical and mechanical explanations, which I'm questioning that that's the only mode of investigation that's valuable, as I think all of us, agree with to some degree. Hence the ascendance of physicalist theories of mind and nature, which boast amenability to the state of the art in neuroscience and particle physics. There's a perfectly natural impulse to turn to positivism, because the sciences, and in virtue of their precise empirical observation and mathematical formalization, have brought us extremely reliable knowledge about the physical world. The mistake is to infer hastily from this datum of the reliability of the sciences to the dubious view that the methods of the sciences are the only way to arrive at knowledge, a view which I've shown is self-defeating. Positivism is a view arrived at by thinkers, encouraged by the reliability of the sciences, not one proven by a scientific methodology itself. Thought, while undoubtedly fallible, goes beyond the empirical and ranges over more of the world. The scientific ranges over the empirically observable, the physical cosmos. Thought ranges over both that and the intellectually accessible, mathematics, logic, normativity, being, if we want to get into ontology, all of which the physical depends on. To conclude, in order to think anew, philosophy must disabuse itself of its lingering positivism, an ideology that I would argue is corrosive to the philosophical project itself. Philosophy is predicated on the principle that thought can apprehend truth. The recognition of the inadequacy of our mode of thought to apprehend truth is only possible because thought is afforded access into what an account of the world could look like. no discipline which presupposes positivism will ever be able to explain to a satisfactory degree the relationship between our minds and that which our minds can grasp, which we contemplate. To think anew, philosophy must come home to thought. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrick. Fantastic presentation. I've just added your discussion questions to the chat. Very passionate. So again, if anybody has any questions or comments, just use the raise hand function and I will call on you.
If I could just add, maybe I think I wish I had room in my paper to say this, but I think to some degree or less, all of our disciplines, I emphasize philosophy because of course that's the discipline where I'm coming from, but I think all of us use methods which are not necessarily I don't know, they're not replicable and empirical methods, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Oh, sorry, yeah.
So I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed listening to the other presenters this evening is that there does seem to be a somewhat of a common thread that is happening in all these presentations. And there is a recognition, Seraphina, in your paper of, this interconnectivity. And I feel like a little bit of what you're saying, Patrick, is there's sort of this like elbowing out of certain disciplines because they're not legitimate. And I heard this in Bianca's paper as well, this tension between what is valid and what is not valid. And I think what's really important for these disciplines that it does feel like in some ways maybe aren't taken as seriously because they're not empirically proven, is a remembering of, again, I think where a lot of us were kind of going is where we came from and what is the story, what is the narrative that we have all inherited. And, this is something that I actually wanted to include in my paper as well. And it's the work of a scholar named Richard King, and he had a critique of the Orientalist. And one of the things that he mentioned was the division between the private and the public. And I heard a little bit of this in your paper, Patrick. And, this was a product of the European Enlightenment of, what was deemed to be public was science, was empirical, what was provable, what was social, and what was private was what was irrational, and it was the spiritual, and it was the mystical. And what he was saying was that, before that moment, even within European culture, those divisions did not divide. Now, since my subject is more within the realm of yoga, certainly within South Asia, the integration of the I guess we could call it maybe the spiritual and the mundane. There was no division there. And I think that's the thing that would be really helpful for all of us to remember, is that we have inherited this narrative that everything gets divided into compartments. And what I heard from Seraphina is, this idea of an integration, that everything is interrelated. And instead of trying to create a hierarchy of what is valid and what isn't, why are we not able to lean into one another and be able to learn from these different disciplines and support one another for, visions that are going to uplift our society rather than continue to pull each other down? So thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters. They were really just such great pieces of work. I enjoyed it so much.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. Right, I totally agree. No, Yeah, there's so much there. I love what you just said. I mean, yeah, often in philosophy, I guess our department is known for, we often uh, put Descartes as the bad guy, because he's one of those first ones who kind of, he makes this division between the primary and the secondary qualities. Primary qualities are the numerical kind of patterns in nature, and the secondary qualities, those are the things that happen in our minds. But and whether or not this was his purpose, and I'm not sure this is exactly what he actually intended this to happen, but I think it's exactly what you're saying, where just everything on the side of mind, that's by definition not true, and everything that we don't have in the world outside, that's the only real stuff. And I think that's where I think such a core aspect of all of the liberal art in BCLA are founded on the principle that the things on this side of are, and even that dualism I think is untenable anyway. But yeah, no, yeah, no, thanks so much.
If I may, Patrick, I mean, your second question connects well with all the other papers as well. And a comment I'd actually made to Megan with her paper, but how should non-empirical disciplines engage with their empirical counterparts? Philosophy and other non-empirical disciplines must stay connected to their empirical counterparts. So yes, I take Megan's paper to be, on the one hand, we can talk about health and we can talk about the body, for example, in yoga, but we also have to talk about the spiritual of yoga. We have to talk about the actual practice of yoga, right? And similarly here, right? I think philosophy gets in trouble when it tries to tell science what it's doing. It's equally a problem when science says we have everything. We're doing everything. What we have to do is find a way to respect each other's insight and then ask, how do we think? Now, my one philosophical, kind of response, Patrick, is Enlightenment actually did want some of that. It's just that, like all kinds of things, it goes awry. But because on the one hand, you have this pure scientism, but you also have this wonderful romanticism at that historical moment. I think the wars of the 19th century and definitely the beginning of the 20th century kind of killed off all romantic spirit. And all that was left at the end of the day was this cold scientific. I mean, we can literally drop a bomb that deatomizes people. And so now we're just in the age of atoms, because your death can literally be the undoing of atoms now. So how do we rekindle the kind of fullness, going back to the designation principle, kingdom of God is human being fully alive. How do we come back to this fullness of life? A wonderful Christian phrase as well, right? Just the fullness of life. And I think science and philosophy and literature, right, and theology and yoga studies, both in terms of academic discipline and practice, is trying to raise us to a higher sense of being. And I guess I'm not as pessimistic about that, because, I mean, this very evening is a perfect example that it can be done.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. And just wanted to, we can move into our last 30-minute Q&A. So again, this 30-minute discussion time is for all the audience members to ask their questions, to get clarification, or to comment on one of the presenters' presentations. This is just a time, the floor is open. So if you have anything to say or any questions, raise your hand and I will call on you. We have until 7 p.m. and the conversation can keep going a little bit after that if we want, okay? Yes, David?
Yeah, so my comments are for Patrick, because we're friends and I'm familiar with this paper now. And it's really like just responding to your kind of question, how should we engage with empirical counterparts and just the sciences broadly. I think there used to be this vision of philosophy that just a very totalizing vision that, you know, we are the mother of all the sciences. But then with all the developments of science in the 19th and 20th century, it's a tough act to follow, right? So I think we have to, on some level, question that kind of role in relation to sciences of like, oh, we are telling you what you're actually doing. But on the other hand, which is precisely what you've laid out in this paper, there's another tendency, which is to just say, well, science always gets the last word on everything. And to kind of make an example of this and how one could try to be in the middle is, I mean, just the example of this table in front of me. Like there's the manifest table that I'm used to in life. I write my papers on it. I eat, you know, using it. It's very familiar to me. But then there's the scientific image of this exact same table, but it's completely different. It's not solid. It's actually mostly empty. There's electrical charges always going through it. But those two images can never actually meet. And I would say every physicist, when they sit down at the dinner table, well, they're going to have the manifest image of that table. You know, it's just unavoidable, which is not to say that the scientific image is false. It's just another one of these images that they kind of appear to us. And I would say to your question, like what is to be done with, I'll take philosophy in relation to the sciences. I would say it's to just reflect on those conditions under which science occurs, which is not to place ourselves above it. But also I think in that there could be some sense of meaningful engagement also with the sciences, just assuming that they don't just outright, like Stephen Hawking says, you know, philosophy is pointless. It's dead because sciences can answer all of the questions that philosophy was intended to, except for the very questions about science itself and ethics and beauty and all these other things you raised. Assuming that that's not the attitude, and I don't think it should be, but also we shouldn't have the attitude that we're somehow have this kind of epistemic or moral authority above them. I think there's a possibility of a genuine kind of meaningful engagement between the two.
Yeah, I agree. And right, of course, me and David have talked a lot about this, but I totally agree, and I hope I didn't overstate. I think I did have a line in my paper where I got maybe slightly platonic. I got a little overzealous, but that's it seems I think the hermeneutic kind of approach that you were. I mean, there were hints of hermeneutics in there. That seems to be that's such an exciting way forward, where maybe it was a quote from Dr. Trunner, I think, that you told me about, but as well, but that there are nearly an infinite interpretations of a text. At least in this case, it sounds like he was talking about text and stuff. But there's also, what was it, like an infinite incorrect series of interpretations as well. And that sounds right too. And yeah, they need to be. It's strange that in one, both incommensurable but at the same time true. And how I'm hopeful though. Yeah, I'm hopeful though as well. Anyway.
One comment I had about Bianca's paper had to do with the students don't come in as blank slates. I think pushing academia towards that you know, like that realization, I should say. I think that's what needs to happen. That push needs to happen towards the realization that we are not these blank slates coming into these college classes, and that we do have all of this this baggage and all this background that's coming with us. And I think about, again, because I'm a philosophy student, a lot of the background I think I'm thinking about is so I'm kind of losing it right now. The blank slates and the forgive me, I'm drawing a blank slate right now. uh, but a lot of modern philosophy today is is actually doing that uh, to the dominant philosophical tradition right now. You know, it's making those claims about we are not these blank slates. We don't have these. Uh, I mean, I'm thinking of Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, who explicitly says thought, thinking, as Patrick is talking about here, is not common, nor is it inherently good. There is a lot of baggage that comes with it. There is no common sense, and perhaps Dr. Stone could say more about this because he knows more about it than I do. But that the thinking itself does have a lot of this baggage, a lot of this stuff that is taken for granted, stuff that goes under the radar, stuff that is subconscious, and it can be both useful and harmful to address those biases, as Megan was calling them. Useful and helpful to address those, to bring those out, to uncover them, and uncover those, you know, those crazy roots, because they are connected to the identity of the person, connected to dominant concepts dominating certain discourses, and connected to marginalized concepts also within those discourses. But yeah, that's kind of where my mind is going whenever you're talking about that.
Yeah, I think like a part of it for me is like we try to think of these new and fun, innovative ways to teach students, but I feel like we never take into consideration student receptiveness to it. Like we sort of treat them in trying to better their education, we try to treat them as though they don't matter. And so I think a big part of, I guess, thinking anew and moving forward is remembering that the student is a person and that education in and of itself should be a conversation, not one person just talking at another. Because then it's not, I think that's a pedagogy of the oppressed, the banking concept. You're sort of just dumping information into somebody that they'll get rid of once they feel like they don't need it. But if we treat education like a conversation, then maybe that won't happen. Or I hope that's where we'll go.
Yes, Chet.
Hi, my question's kind of directed towards Pat. So you talked a bit about the dialogue that needs to happen between the sciences and the humanities, and I'm wondering whether you lean towards the idea that it's more of like an issue of degree, that there just needs to be more intersubjective meeting of the minds, or does it, because of the sort of totalizing claim of the sciences, does it fall on the humanities to sort of bring something new to the table, bring a new language or a new method of communicating with the sciences to sort of bridge this gap?
Yeah, it seems, and I mean, even relevant to even what just Bianca said too. I think there is a necessity to, for all of us, I think in all of our fields, to assert, find a way that I mean, this is the tension, right? We don't want to sacrifice our commitments to the truth, but at the same time, and some people are not always receptive to perhaps this truth at all. That's very hard. But sometimes, hopefully, I think in most of the time, it's a matter of working with them where they're at too. And that could be very painful. I mean, this is a theme I think we've all been talking about, and I uh, I hope all of us could respond to this question too in some way, because in because often some, people are very comfortable where they're at, and we need to extend olive branches, and it looks different for each thing. I think with the sciences, what I'm thinking about in particular is philosophy, and I think the work it does, in a sense, it enables a lot of mathematics is a good example. Mathematics, the axioms with which mathematics chooses to get like piano arithmetic or different laws of geometry. That is something where philosophers, I think, and people in mathematics are talking, where it's like you're kind of questioning how does thought kind of, what are the rules of thought, so to speak, and then how does this translate into number? What does it mean to be a number? I think that's where the dialogue happens, and it's idiosyncratic with every discipline. But I'm thinking too of Megan's project too, of not sacrificing the. I'll let this Megan talk about this if she wants to. But I mean, this is what I was thinking about too, is bringing yoga to everybody, but not sacrificing the deeply rigorous, meaningful roots of it and the tradition it's steeped in too. And it looks different, I think, for everyone. But I think in the case of the sciences, I think by appealing to things like intelligibility is often the way we do that, at least in that's like the common thread that I think we could build something off of personally. But yeah.
Yeah, there's some larger questions that arise here. Back to Seraphina's, you referenced Pope Francis and his use of the word paresia. I don't know exactly what, whether, can you expand on that actually a little bit about like, are we getting at like circuitousness in speech, or like freedom of speech or ability to speak freely?
So Pope Francis has talked about paresia in a number of contexts and homilies, and he's usually saying something a little bit different each time. I think he's generally speaking about it with this sense of being bold with both speech and action and being able to speak freely. I think that he has more recently been connecting paresia with the current synod, and paresia being a kind of synodal call, that it's not just about listening or being together, but it's also about the things that we do with our speech and our actions as well.
Thanks for expanding on that. Yeah, it seems to resonate with Bianca's presentation as well, just about dialect itself and language as a changing set of material. How is the self? How do we represent the objective or subjective self through language across time? I think there's some larger questions there that come to mind as well that would be fun to think about. And on the science, Patrick, I think you're talking about your question there. Can thought itself really access things that science cannot? So would you say, to kind of transpose that, would you say that science is able to access an objective view of self, or how would it do so?
Yeah, and everything I've been saying too, by the way, is as sure Dr. Stone and Braden and all the other people, these are not necessarily popular views, but I guess how I would address that question is I would say science can't address the nature of the self, again, because I think the self is private. I think, again, some people have a broader conception of the sciences that do encompass the self. I think that's okay, but then I just start to wonder about how we go about distinguishing different fields. And I think one of the for me at least, the best way to distinguish between science and perhaps even the liberal arts more broadly, is that science does, in a deep sense, principally, not completely, but principally depends on empirical observation, which by definition can only happen for some kind of a measurement of something that takes place in the spatiotemporal world. I have some somewhat strong views about the nature of the self. I don't think it really is something necessarily spatiotemporal or something physical that you could detect in that sense. But so I guess that would be how I would, and I think, but and that is to kind of sell the upshot of this. I think that's a lot of the things we care about. Theology, the nature of God. That's not, and so much of, I think, the movements about religion are misguided because they pretend as if, oh, well, if God was real, we would be able to spot him with a telescope in the sky somewhere, or and that's definitely the view that Dawkins seems to have often. And that's what, and so broadly, I want to just be reorienting and deputizing the methods of the liberal arts, which I think are distinct from the sciences in that sense. Sorry for the rant. I'll stop. I'll stop rambling.
I may push right on that a little. I mean, I think all the papers today remind us of course, I'm going to be very Foucauldian about this. Although the self is not per se spatio-temporal, it is localized in space and time, right? Be it localized spatially, let's just call that a body, and it's localized temporally, and for the sake of debate, and scientists won't like the word I'm about to say, it's in history, right? So body and history more than space and time would give us a way, particularly when we talk about LGBTQ bodies and the ways that self can emerge from particular bodies, particularly in the case of trans Christians, right, where their very body, when Jesus says, "This is my body," what does that mean, right, to people who have certain relationships to their body? Or when we say things like everyone's in the body of Christ, well, when the body is itself able to be disputed literally, physically, and physiologically in certain ways. This is, of course, looking at Megan's Square. This is where yoga always has had the upper hand, because it's always had to deal with that body and that history that she talked about in her presentation, that then always opens up these new avenues. How do I connect a sense of self with this actual body I have? And so there are things that empirical science help us do. Namely, it helps us figure out these bodies we have, either in the sense of a mere mechanistic physiological body, but also just the truth. As I get older, it gets truer and truer, just the reality of the medical body. And you do need to know something about that. I think science only errs when it thinks all we can talk about is that anatomical body, for example. But similarly, philosophy errs when it thinks it doesn't have to care about the body, right? So there is a way in which science, religion, philosophy, practices of meditation, right? Ways we express ourselves. I have to have a body to write and speak. That's just a fact. But the question becomes, how do we understand the relationships of those things? And how do we fully articulate the possibilities? So once I realize I have a body, there's actually more things I can do in philosophy, namely the things that have to do with having a body. I'm thinking particularly of Iris Marion Young's famous essay, Throwing Like a Girl, which is a marvelous piece of feminist phenomenology about, well, what does it mean to throw like a girl? And if anyone remembers the Super Bowl ad several years ago about girls in sports, and it says run like a girl, and it's like marathon runners and things like that. But these bodies are doing something, and we can trust science insofar as they can talk about, for example, the actual physical constitution of those bodies. But the concept of experience, would be one of those lines, but we do need both.
All right, everyone. If just wanted to throw it out there, if there's any more questions, now is the time to ask them. Before we conclude. Yes, Seraphina?
I just wanted to say one last thing that I was thinking of when Joshua asked about Parisia and Bianca's comment about valuing the needs and desires of your students and that education is a conversation. I really appreciate that, this idea that education really needs to be centered in the relationship and bi-directional. And I think that relates to this call to speak and act with Parisia, because it's one thing for Pope Francis to say, and he's said many, many times over the years, how important this gift from God is for Christians to utilize. It's one thing to say that, and then it's another thing entirely to co-create an environment where people can actually do that. So I think that relates well to your point about education needing to be a conversation, not just like we're saying things and someone's receiving it and that's it. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you, Seraphina. Well, as we draw the curtain on this enlightening session of the BCLA GradConnect Research Symposium, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the journey that we've embarked on together. Over the past 2 hours, we have traversed a landscape rich in ideas, diversity, and intellectual courage, guided by the theme Thinking Anew. We witnessed the power of innovative thought and interdisciplinary dialogue through the insightful presentations of our speakers, from Megan Morris's exploration of evolution within yoga studies to Bianca Gray's critical examination of language in the classroom, Seraphina Blake's reimagination of LGBTQ pastoral accompaniment, and Patrick Hull's philosophical inquiry into the nature of thinking itself. Each presentation has not only enlightened us, but also challenged us to broaden our perspectives. The rich discussions that followed each presentation and the robust exchange of ideas in our concluding session have underscored the importance of communal learning and the sharing of diverse viewpoints. These interactions are the heartbeat of thinking anew, and your contributions have been invaluable. As we close this symposium, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to each of you for your active participation, thought-provoking questions, and the intellectual curiosity you brought into this virtual space. A special thanks to our presenters for their hard work and dedication, and to Dr. Stone for his unwavering support and guidance in making this event a reality. Remember, the conversations and ideas shared today are just the beginning. Let them be the catalyst for future exploration, research, and collaboration as we continue to foster a dynamic and inclusive academic community within BCLA. We look forward to seeing how the seeds planted today will blossom in your future endeavors, and we hope to reconvene in the future to celebrate new achievements and discoveries. Thank you once again for joining us. Wishing you all continued success and inspiration. Everyone has a good evening.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks.